the organizers obtained a permit, and the base set up a free expression zone, and it was used by the demonstrators. The organizers wanted to do this demonstration legally. The base was notified by advance and set aside a free speech zone. And most importantly, John Amidon testified that he did not intend to get arrested that day. He came to the demonstration intending to obey the law. Chief Master Sergeant Ramsey testified that he understood the term free speech to include not only speech but other forms of expression, which included singing, dramatizations, and various forms of free expression. So the charges against John must be viewed in the context of an American citizen participating in a lawful demonstration in a free speech zone created on a drone base. So the first charge that we need to consider is the attempted trespass, which requires that my client attempted to go into a prohibited enclosed area, the area beyond the free speech zone. John was standing in the free speech zone, dressed as the Grim Reaper, in order to dramatize his belief that the drone attacks flown out of Hancock are like the Grim Reaper and that they kill everyone in their range. They don't differentiate between the guilty and the innocent. John climbed onto one of the barriers so that more people could see him. He was not trying to climb over the barrier. There's no evidence that he was actually trying to climb over the barrier. All we have in that regard is Deputy Baker's belief or assumption that he thought John might have been trying to go over the barrier. We have 4 other witnesses who testified that they saw, well, including my client, who testified that they saw him on top of the barrier and that he was not trying to climb over, that it would have been very easy to do so if he had wanted to, that he was walking west when he was suddenly grabbed from behind by the police. And the video also shows this. So I would submit that there is no evidence, let alone evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, showing that my client was trying to climb over this barrier. It's the contrary. The other issue, as I mentioned earlier, is that there's no proof that the area beyond the free speech zone, the area that it's alleged that he was trying to go into, that area was not enclosed all the way. As a matter of fact, it was established by Chief Master Sergeant Ramsey that it would have been possible for someone to walk west from that area and go onto the driveway of the base and then walk out onto East Molay Road without crossing any barriers. So that area was not enclosed. And the case law, including People v. Moore, the New York State Court of Appeals, and the other case, People v. Babiak, the recent case, it makes it very clear that in order for the criminal trespass statute to apply, that area in which the person is trespassing must be fully enclosed. And this area was not fully enclosed. So Mr. Amidon must be acquitted of attempted criminal trespass, both because there was no evidence of an attempt and because the area itself was not enclosed. And then we get to the loitering charge. The mask section of the loitering charge was enacted to prevent gangs or mobs from congregating in ways that might intimidate the public because the identity of the perpetrators would be concealed by masks. It's a really big stretch to say that John, by wearing a mask, was trying to intimidate the drone base. If you look at the history of this loitering statute, many sections of it have been held unconstitutional in the past. The begging section of the loitering statute was declared unconstitutional in 1993 by the courts. Begging was held to be a legitimate exercise of free speech and couldn't be criminalized. Then in 1983, the soliciting for sex portion of the loitering statute was held to be unconstitutional and was held to be constitutionally protected speech. So over the years, various sections of the loitering statute have been found to violate the First Amendment. I actually have a memorandum of law, but I'm going to go through it briefly, and then I can provide it to the court and Mr. McNamara afterwards. But the loitering statute under section Penal Law 240-35 sub 4 provides that being masked or in any manner disguised congregates in a public place with other persons so masked. And then there's an exception. It says, except that such conduct is not unlawful when it occurs in connection with a masquerade party or like entertainment if permission is first obtained from the police. So first of all, the location where my client was said to be wearing his mask was not a public place. Unlike mask statutes in other jurisdictions, such as the one in Georgia, which was held unconstitutional under the First Amendment, New York's law does not include any private property and states that this activity must occur in a public place. In United States v. Appel in 2014, Westlaw 714696, the United States Supreme Court held that the public can be excluded from a military base, even including portions where the military doesn't have exclusive use. And even in that case where there was a free speech zone, but the Supreme Court held that since this was not a public place, the base could still exclude the public from that area if they chose to do so, which shows that it's not a public place. So for that reason alone, the loitering he can't be convicted of the loitering statute. And in addition, there's been no evidence that my client was congregating with other persons so masked. While there may have been one or more others in the large crowd who were wearing some type of mask, there was not even any evidence that my client was aware of anyone else wearing a mask. So if anybody comes to a protest knowing about this statute, and they would believe that they're not violating it because they're the only person wearing a mask. But if two people did that unbeknownst to each other, they could potentially be charged without knowing that they were supposedly congregating with somebody else wearing a mask. So I submit that if the statute is interpreted in that way, it would be unconstitutionally vague and overbroad. So those are the first two elements, that it was not a public place and that he wasn't shown to be congregating with other people so masked. I believe he would have to be aware of that. And then further, if this loitering law is construed to prevent wearing a mask as part of a street theater performance during a permitted protest, it's unconstitutional. While the constitutionality of this statute was upheld by the Second Circuit in Church of the Ku Klux Klan v. Carrick in 2004, this situation is distinguishable in that the use of the Grim Reaper mask here, which was not intended to obscure Mr. Amadon's identity, but was an act of political theater, it should be considered protected speech. And as I mentioned before, in the Ku Klux Klan v. Carrick case, the court said that even though the Klan had the right to free speech and that it was symbolic speech by wearing their hoods, they would be able to express that same symbolic speech without the detachable mask. But here, to distinguish that case, Mr. Amadon needed his Grim Reaper mask in order for people to understand his symbolic speech, which was the point that the court was making, is that they had to understand that symbolic speech for it to be communicative, First Amendment protected activity. They would not have understood what he was doing if he didn't wear the mask, because they wouldn't have known he was dressing up as the Grim Reaper and conveying what that meant. In addition, Mr. Amadon was not trying to obscure his identity, as the people were in the Carrick case and in the other cases under the New York State mask statute. Another one is People v. Aboaf, 2001, New York County, and People v. Bull, in the appellate term, First Department 2004, and in Bull, the court noted that the defendants were likely they were wearing bandanas covering their faces, and noted that they were convicted because they were likely trying to conceal their identity because they were in possession of items such as paint-filled balloons and metal slingshot-type cannons used for hurling the balloons. So there was an intent to engage in illegal activity, which we don't have here. There's no intent to engage in any illegal activity, and there's no intent to obscure his identity. That's not why he was wearing this Grim Reaper mask. He was wearing it in order to participate in an act of political theater in connection with the symbolic funeral procession commemorating the victims of drone attacks. So this, when you look at the exception for masquerade party or like entertainment under this statute, the evidence has shown that the permit was obtained, which stated that the protesters would be carrying props. It didn't state exactly what they would be, and it didn't refer specifically to masks, but it has been held in another case that a street theater protest such as this falls within this exception and qualifies as like entertainment under the statute. That case was Schumann v. New York. It's a Southern District federal case from 1967 involving the Bread and Puppet Theater, and in that case, the court stated that the plaintiffs, which are the members of the Bread and Puppet Theater, have taken part in public demonstrations in New York City opposing U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. They customarily appear at these demonstrations in costumes and masks, which are designed to heighten the protest of the day. A police officer threatened them with arrest under the New York mask statute, which at that time required 3 or more masked persons and had the same or very similar, nearly identical exception for entertainment. Upon being so warned, they discontinued their demonstration. And then the court went on to say, this statute, by its very terms, protects the activities of these plaintiffs. It does not demean the seriousness of the Bread and Puppet Theater's efforts to make the obvious observation that these masquerade protests are entertainment, and nonetheless so because of any social or political themes or overtones. So the court said that that exception applied to people doing street theater. So therefore, the court should find that under these circumstances, given that there was a permit obtained allowing for props, that John Amidon's Grim Reaper costume fell within the activity protected by the permit, and thus the masquerade entertainment exception to the loitering statute. So finally, I would argue that if the statute is construed in such a way as to criminalize my client's activities, it would be unconstitutional under the First Amendment, would be overbroad and void for vagueness. And there have been several cases which held that anti-mask statutes such as this one violate the First Amendment when they are not construed to require an intent to conceal one's identity or an intent to harm others in some way. And it's another Ku Klux Klan case, Church of the American Knights of the Ku Klux Klan v. City of Erie, Western District of Pennsylvania, 2000, and I have all these sites. An anti-mask ordinance, even though it contains several other intent requirements beyond this one, was still unconstitutionally overbroad and vague due to its impact on First Amendment protected speech. In yet another Ku Klux Klan case, American Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, Northern District of Indiana Federal Court, 1999. In that case, an anti-mask ordinance, even though it required an intent to conceal one's identity, still violated the First Amendment. In Arian v. Mackey, Northern District of Texas, federal case, a university could not prevent students from wearing masks at protests because they had a First Amendment right to do so. In Robinson v. Florida, in 1981, the Supreme Court of Florida held that a nearly identical anti-mask statute was unconstitutionally overbroad. In Daniels v. State, the Supreme Court of Georgia in 1994 construed a very similar anti-mask statute to require an intent to conceal one's identity and knowledge that one's actions are intimidating to others. In Hernandez v. Commonwealth, the Court of Appeals of Virginia in 1991 construed a very similar statute to require an intent to conceal one's identity. And in Ghaffari v. Municipal Court, in the Court of Appeals in California, held that an anti-mask statute, even though it required an intent to conceal one's identity, was still unconstitutionally overbroad and vague in violation of the First Amendment. So this City of Erie case, where there was a statute, was a city ordinance from the City of Erie, Pennsylvania, it was even more protective of free speech than New York's statute. In that case, the court said that the plaintiffs are looking for a preliminary injunction precluding enforcement of the city's anti-mask ordinance, which imposes criminal penalties for concealment of one's identity in public when coupled with certain specified intent requirements. And then the intent requirements were one or more of the following: with the intent to deprive anyone of the equal protection of the laws, with the intent by force or threat of force to injure, intimidate, or interfere with any person because of his exercise of any right, or C, with the intent to intimidate, threaten, abuse, or harass any other person. And then there's with the intent to cause another person to fear for his or her safety, or while engaged in other illegal conduct with the intent of avoiding identification. The court said, plaintiffs contend that the hoods which cover the Klan members' faces constitute a form of symbolic speech which is protected by the First Amendment. We have little trouble accepting this proposition. Thus, we conclude that the wearing of hoods constitutes symbolic speech which is entitled to First Amendment protection. The court found that most of the intent subsections were not unconstitutional, and they don't apply to New York statute. On the other hand, they invalidated Section C, which said that you can't wear a mask with the intent to intimidate, threaten, abuse, or harass any other person. And the court said, unlike the other intent provisions, subsection C can be interpreted such that an individual runs afoul of this provision of the ordinance simply by engaging in protected First Amendment activity while wearing a mask. And that is what New York statute says. And this court said that this section wasn't good enough because the terms intimidate, threaten, abuse, and harass are not defined, and that they could encompass forms that are constitutionally protected, and then said, in fact, in the instant case, the mere wearing of a mask alone may constitute a violation because that provision can be interpreted as criminalizing the mere wearing of a mask where it is intended that the mask will itself send a message which is intimidating to another person. Such an application is problematic because it infringes on the communication of ideas which are constitutionally protected. We conclude, therefore, that this section is capable of interpretations which substantially impact unprotected forms of speech and is overbroad on its face. We also conclude that it is unconstitutionally vague. And so that ordinance was held unconstitutional, even though it was more protective than the statute that we're dealing with. In this case, John's Grim Reaper costume was clearly protected symbolic speech under the First Amendment, as he was communicating his belief that the Grim Reaper is an appropriate symbol of the Air Force drone program. As the court in City of Erie found, a statute which makes this illegal in the absence of an intent to harm others is unconstitutionally overbroad and vague. And in Robinson v. Florida, the Florida statute there said, no person shall wear any mask and enter upon public property. So a simple statute. Appellant challenged the constitutionality of the statute. It's nearly identical to New York statute, except it doesn't say other persons so masked. And the court said, we agree that the statute deprives him of due process because it is overbroad. We find that this law is susceptible of application to entirely innocent activities. The statutory words are not susceptible of any limiting construction, and reverse the conviction under that statute. So basically, because of the Second Circuit decision in Carrick and the other New York cases are distinguishable here, and because federal cases and cases from high courts of other states have found similar statutes cannot be applied to criminalize actions such as my client's, this court should find John Amadon not guilty of loitering.